Welcome to Podnutz Daily for March 19th, 2008. First thing I want to talk about today is Dell and repairing the DC Power Jacks in Dell laptops. Now, if you've had the misfortune of having to repair a Dell Power Jack on one of these computers, you're going to notice that Dell likes to use not very standard types of input jacks. They usually have 3 pins. There's 2 main kinds that have the 3 pins. There's one that's got 3 pins in a triangle configuration, and then there's the one that's around, and it's like a round circle with a little pin on the inside, rather than most AC adapters that are round and have a hole on the inside. Anyway, this is one that had a pin on the inside, and the voltage is what you want to get when you're testing the adapter. First of all, it's a good idea to test the adapter, make sure it works before you go ahead and replace the power jack. The outer ring of the adapter is the ground. The inner ring of the adapter is 19 volts, around 19 volts, and then the pin is around 4 or 5 volts, I believe. So be careful when you're testing those two, because you could short out the inner ring and the pin if you touch them together. Now, in this particular computer, the owner was complaining that he had to jiggle the power jack to get power to the computer. It would work sometimes and it wouldn't work sometimes, and that usually means a bad solder joint on the inside. Or it could mean that the jack is really damaged and needs to be replaced. But most of the times you could get away with a solder job on these type of jobs. When the customer says that he has to jiggle the cord to get it to work, it's usually a good indicator for you that things aren't probably too terrible on the inside and it's repairable. So I opened it up and it appeared that everything was making a connection. It was a little strange, this job. But upon further inspection, I noticed that the lead coming from the DC jack was actually not making a connection with the motherboard, though it looked like it, because the lead actually goes through the motherboard to the bottom side of the motherboard and makes the connection there. And the break in the connection was occurring right at the point where the jack goes through the hole to go to the other side of the motherboard. So it was hard to see. But here's how I like to fix AC or DC jacks on the laptops. Most of the time when you're doing a repair job because the jack is loose, if you just simply find the spot on the motherboard where the lead has disconnected from and resolder it, you're going to run into the same problem. Because now the jack, just from daily use and normal use, the jack will become loose just as a natural thing. And if you just go ahead and resolder the lead to the motherboard, because the jack is loose and if the computer's a little older, it just tends to come off again. The method I use allows the jack to remain loose and still make the connection. Basically, here's what I do. If instead of soldering the lead directly to the motherboard, I solder the lead that's coming out of the DC jack to a small, tiny piece of wire, maybe 1/2 inch to 1 inch, probably about 1 inch long. Now, when I say tiny, I don't mean the gauge of the wire. I mean the length of the wire. The gauge has to be strong enough to handle 19 volts or whatever the power adapter is putting out. And I solder one end of the lead. Actually, I'm sorry. I solder one end of the wire to the lead coming off of the DC jack. And then I solder the other end of the wire to the spot on the motherboard where the lead is supposed to touch. This way, you can still jiggle the DC jack and have some play, and it won't snap your solder connection that you just soldered because it's attached by a wire, and the wire has flexibility. So you're giving yourself a little bit of a cushion here that the customer can jiggle the jack, and you don't have to be afraid that it's going to rip the DC jack off the motherboard again. So if you use a little tiny piece of wire, and it's usually in a very precarious position where these solder joints are. So if the customer does move the jack one little bit, if you solder directly to the motherboard, there's a high chance that it would break. So using this wire gives you a lot of leeway, and it gives you some play. Obviously, if the jack is going to fall off the motherboard, you don't want to use that, or you want to solder it on properly. But if the jack is tight, but the solder connection is not tight, if you use a wire, it actually helps out a lot because it'll last a longer time for the customer, and they won't be bringing it back to you anytime soon. Hope that makes sense. It's a little hard to speak that through and visualize that. I have a picture of it in my mind. I hope I was able to transfer it to yours. Okay, next thing is I had a laptop today that was stuck at the startup screen, which is the BIOS screen. It was a Winbook laptop. I think that's Micro Center's brand of laptops. Not too popular, but they're decent. And I powered it on. The boot up screen, the Winbook screen, flashed as the first screen, and then would stick there. Now, sometimes it could be that memory is bad, it's causing it to stick, or a hard drive isn't able to be found easily by the computer, and that's causing it to stick. But I worked with the memory and I worked with the hard drive, and it was neither of those were the problem. What I finally found was after I took the cover off the bottom of the laptop, there was a heat sink that was glued by the company on top of the graphics card chip. There was an ATI chip with a heat sink which had come off. The heat sink had come off the chip and was just floating around down on the motherboard, and it must have shorted something out. You're going to find BIOS problems a lot when there's a short on the motherboard somewhere. You're going to be scratching your head and trying to figure out what the problem is, and you're going to check the hard drive, and you're going to check the memory, you're going to check all these things, but it's actually something that's shorting out the motherboard. So luckily, when I took that heat sink off of the motherboard where it was stuck, and I put it back onto the chip where it was supposed to be, the system booted up fine. Now, another thing that had happened, see, the customer must have dropped the computer because that wasn't the only problem. The other thing that had happened was there was another heat sink that had come disconnected from the motherboard. It wasn't making a short anywhere on the motherboard. It had just come disconnected enough to probably cause the chip under it to overheat a little bit. And overheating, like I talked in the previous podcast, overheating can cause a computer to just hang up at a certain spot. So between the overheating of that chip and the other heatsink that was sitting across the motherboard and creating a short, that's the problems that were causing that on the Winbook laptop. Fixed another laptop today that was a Samsung laptop, which is very rare in the U.S., which is where I am. And you could tell it wasn't an American laptop because all the letters on the keyboard were Chinese. So there was also English letters on it too, but there was also Chinese letters with that. The problem was it uses an AC adapter that is available nowhere in the States. And that was the problem with the laptop. Somebody had given it to the customer, and the customer had ran the battery down. The battery died, and he didn't have an AC adapter, and then he was out of luck. So he wanted me to get an AC adapter for him and also check out the operating system, make sure everything was okay. I purchased an AC adapter for that specific model. It was a Samsung, I can't remember the model, on eBay. And I'm including this story because I just want to say that best place to buy AC adapters is definitely eBay. I mean, if you go to a store and buy an AC adapter for a laptop, you're going to spend like $100. You could buy the same one on eBay for $30. Just make sure you find a reputable seller with high feedback. I know in a lot of these podcasts we talk about eBay a lot, but it's a great place to buy parts. I mean, if it wasn't for eBay, it'd be tough for a lot of us computer techs to find cheap parts.